Jatindra Kumar Nayak ji, a retired professor of English, Utkal University, Odisha. He has won Katha Translation Award in 1997 and Hutch Crossword Indian Fiction Translation Award in 2004. Oxford University Press, India published his English translation of the Odia novel Yantrarodha, Astride the Veil in 2003. He has co-translated into English Fakir Mohan Senapati's classic Odia novel Chha Mana Atha Guntha and Senapati's autobiography Atma Jivan Charitra. His English translation of J. P. Das's Odia novel Desa Kal Patra was published by Penguin Books in 2009. He was a member Rajaram Mohan Ray Library Foundation and a member of Tagore Commemoration Committee, Department of Culture, Government of India. He is Editor-in-Chief, Marg Asia, a biannual journal published by the Center for Asian Studies, Bhubaneswar. Now I invite Shri Om Dwivedi ji. Om Dwivedi ji is Associate Professor of English and Head of the School of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences at Oro University, Surat, Gujarat. His books include Indian Writing in English in the Global Literary Market, Re-Orientalism and Indian Writing in English. This he co-authored with Lisa Lau. Human Rights in Post-Colonial India. He is also the Deputy Chair of the International Research Network, Challenging Precarity. And now I invite Professor Rohit Manchandari. Please. Rohit ji has written 2 novels, In the Light of the Black Sun, which won the Betty Trask Award, and the other novel, A Place in Mind, which was a recipient of the Tiber Jones South Asia Prize. He has also authored a narrative history of IIT Bombay, the institute where he lives and works. His teaching and research interests lie in the area of computational neurophysiology. He has thrice won IIT Bombay's Excellence in Teaching Award, and in 2019 was a recipient of the Teachers Award from the Indian National Science Academy. Literature and nature engross him equally, and he has essayed depictions of nature in both his fiction and his non-fiction. On the science flank, Rohit ji has published research articles in some of the premier journals in his field, including the Journal of Physiology, the Journal of Computational Neuroscience, and PLOS Computational Biology. Now I request the chair to please take the charge of the session.
Distinguished panelists and distinguished participants. I'll take a few minutes to just put the subject in context, because formally speaking, eco-criticism is about 25 years old now, this year actually, because it was launched officially in 1995 in a conference in University of Colorado, Boulder, where I was there because I was invited to present a paper. So it's about quarter century now. But if you look at the history of nature writing and criticism of nature writing and all, it goes much behind that. I mean, if you look at the indigenous people, for example, all the seminars which have been happening today, all the sessions, this is a good summation of what was happening. Indigenous people perforce had to develop a vision about nature because it is about their living. When the religions came in, they gave it a more spiritual dimension to vision about nature. So it's from antiquity, this vision about nature was always there. But the question now we face in the last 2 centuries is how natural becomes culture. This is the question basically we started addressing. Then came how natural becomes political. Then of course how natural becomes economic with the Industrial Revolution. How natural becomes economic. So these are 3 dimensions even today in eco-criticism being articulated by various strands of eco-criticism. Eco-criticism is as the American critic Lawrence Buell has defined, it's a kind of umbrella for where you can accumulate a whole lot of streams of thinking. So, if you look at eco-criticism proper in the modern times, I would say that it goes back to John Ruskin, the British thinker, critic, and his book, 5-volume book called Modern Painters could be seen as one of the progenitors of eco-criticism. Then again in the 19th century there was the leftist stream of eco-criticism, you could say. There was William Morris was there, who wrote a very famous novel called News from Nowhere. It's a post-industrial utopia which he wrote just a few years before his death. So it goes back, say, to 19th century, but in modern times, as I said, it's about 25 years old. So I would just put a few points without taking much time from the speakers. 95, after this conference, the first eco-criticism reference book, you could say, was published. It was called Eco-Criticism Reader. It was edited by Cheryl Glodfelty, who was at that time vice chair of the ASLI, Association of Study of Literature and Environment. She defined eco-criticism as the stream of nature, in literature, it is only the wild which attracts. No, sorry, I'm reading something else. Sorry. Need a space. I'm sorry. So Glodfelty defined eco-criticism as look at the exact words, so just give me a little time. Okay. Human culture is connected to the physical world, affecting it and affected by it. Eco-criticism takes as its subject the interconnection between nature and culture, specifically the cultural artifacts of language and literature. As a critical stance, it has one foot in literature and the other on land. As a theoretical discourse, it negotiates between the human and the non-human. This was a premise which ASLI follows, and I was a member of ASLI for many years, but I discontinued my membership a few years back because I found it was getting stuck in this kind of definition, because eco-criticism as the ASLI version was really not growing. So my stand has been slightly different. I'll elaborate a few why one could differ from that kind of ASLI kind of stand on eco-criticism. Basically, ASLI follows a Thoreauvian tradition. Henry David Thoreau, I don't know, some of you must have read his book Walden. Thoreau's nature mysticism has become the backbone of American eco-criticism. So it revolves around that. So, but today the world is different. We are no more in the nature mysticism period. We have moved much ahead, where things like economic relationship with the material world has become very, very important. The issues like we were talking about indigenous people displacement, what is it all about? That an economic philosophy which today dominates the world is destroying a lot of things in the name of modernity. So the economic relationship with the material world becomes an important issue to be articulated in eco-criticism. I'm skipping a lot of things because I don't want to take much time. I had prepared a few things. Okay, so Western eco-criticism, as I said, has mostly been in the Thoreauvian tradition. But if you look at our part of the world, the developing countries, the so-called developing countries, or the third world term now is out of fashion, it's no more relevant. But In our parts, it's about livelihoods. It's about displacing people. It's about destroying livelihoods. Because when you destroy a river, you are destroying livelihoods of lakhs and crores of people. So in our parts of the world, it's about livelihood issues. It's about destroying the material basis of life. So unless you articulate many of these issues, and I have scanned, in the Indian novel also, I have scanned quite a bit about what's happening in Indo-Anglian and the regional novels in India. It's mostly about livelihoods. If you look at, you start from Kerala, for example. Kerala, the language in which I write mostly, the eco-literature is quite rich. I first wrote on short story, and to my surprise, I found that I could get at least 400 short stories to analyze in my first book, which was about 425-page book, which got the Sahitya Akademi award. So Malayalam literature is very rich in short story and poetry, and nowadays, in the last 20 years, even the novel, the ecological theme is being articulated quite strongly. The latest being Sarah Joseph's novel Butini, which is based on the dam issue, the dam construction issue, and how it destroys ecology and lives of people. So, and then you come northwards, Tamil, for example. I just gave a few examples. Tamil, the history of the tamarind, water. There are novels like that. Then I've not written down all the names. You come to Kannada, Sivaramakaran's novels. There are many more actually. Sivaramakaran's novels are a good example. You travel northwards, you come to even you can go back to Premchand. Premchand is being reread ecologically today. You go to Bengal, Aditya Barman's novel on Titash, the river called Titash. So there are any number of novels. You take Assamese. Today I was reading Indira Goswami's The Man from Chinnamasta. So Indian literature, regional literature is rich. Recently I have been collecting Indo-Anglian literature also. This trend has become quite strong in Indo-Anglian novels also. I have at least 15-20 novels which can be called eco-novels in Indo-Anglian fiction today. So it's about life, it's about livelihood, it's about economic relationship with the material world, and then of course there is a political connotation to that. And the political connotation is that industrial capitalism today has reached a stage where it is probably leading to our extinction. Because the climate change, we all talk about climate change. Because I specialize in energy for last 20 years. So I can say for certain that we are on the point of extinction in maybe few decades because of one thing, that is climate change, which was caused by burning of fossil fuels. And it was nobody's considered mistake or anything. It's a historical thing. I'm not saying somebody did burn coal or petrol or diesel purposefully, but it's a historical thing. But today the reality is that last year you will be surprised, the carbon emissions in the world was 56 billion tons. If you say in Indian arithmetics, it's 5,600 crore tons of pollution we emitted into the air. So that is how it is growing. And it's growing every year. If we go this way, scientists are predicting that by 2030, we will have serious calamities happening. It's already happening. We saw in India from 2013 onwards, from what happened in the abode of goats in Uttarakhand to various regions. Every year it is happening now. Last 3 years, every year something or other is happening. So climate change is really taking us to an extinction point, and I am not seeing any hope for stopping this. So if we continue this way, the threat of extinction hangs before us. Then extractive capitalism, whatever we spoke about, the indigenous people being displaced and all that in the previous sessions, it's because of extractive capitalism. They're extracting natural resources, and most of the natural resources are under forests. So you displace people, you destroy forests. So extractive capitalism. Then there is this new terminology which has come up in the last few years. We call it fossil capitalism, for example, or carbon capitalism. So these issues are being articulated in international fiction also. There's a new branch, not exactly new, called Cliffy, climate fiction has become a very strong. You must be some of you must have read Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement. It is about how climate change is not being reflected in world literature. So really we are at a point where if we continue this way, this kind of economic relationship with the world, we are going probably the extinction way sometime towards the end of this century. So literature is about what? Literature is about life, and what is the biggest objective reality today? Objective analysis, objective reality is what realism tells us. So the biggest objective reality is this. This is what is happening to our life, to our future. So literature perforce has to address this, and then it offers eco-criticism much beyond nature mysticism or the Thoreauvian tradition or whatever. It offers huge potential in eco-criticism. Of course, certainly human-nature relations and relations with non-humans, that's important. And the problems of pollution, gender issues, marginalization of indigenous communities and marginalization of women. There is a branch of criticism called eco-feminist criticism which has developed. Then there is resistance literature, which has taken a new form. The resistance literature earlier was about workers resisting capitalists and all that, but today the resistance literature is different. We are resisting the incursion of industrialism into people's lives. Then of course utopias and dystopias, you can count, if you really go into the net, you can count hundreds of novels in this genres in English, even outside India, and I talked about India earlier. Then there is risk literature, what is called risk criticism as developed. There is a German theorist called Ulrich Beck who has come up with this concept of risk society, that we are living in a risk society. Anything, a nuclear bomb can fall, anytime a cyclone can come and hit you. So that kind of a risk society. So a branch called risk criticism has developed. Then the latest is that there is a lot of things happening in energy and literature. I mean, there's Imre Seman, I don't know, some of you must have read Imre Seman. Imre Seman has been pioneering these studies on energy and literature, because fossil fuels, after all, it's about energy. So energy and literature, then climate fiction. So I'm just closing. So fiction, as I said, poetry also, there is so much. I mean, like if you go to Nigeria, for example, one country I'm just pointing out where the modern literature has been mostly focused on petroleum extraction in that country. Oil on Blood, novels like Oil on Blood, So eco-literature has become mainstream, I would say, but in criticism, somehow in India I have been working for last more than 20 years. I mean, I started work in 95, so about 25 years, but I'm not saying that kind of development in India in criticism, and a lot of the English works which are coming out in eco-criticism in India are around the Thoreauvian tradition, the nature mystic tradition. This kind of a livelihood perspective, I think, need to be articulated in eco-criticism. Thank you very much.
धन्यवाद जी। अपना आलेख प्रस्तुत करने के लिए मैं अब धनंजय जी को आमंत्रित करता हूँ।
बहुत शुक्रिया। So little as an odd man out, because I'm going to talk about old things, in fact, and also because Thoreau was so much inspired by Indian thought, and I'm going to talk about the pre-modern days. So therefore not about, though I would like to, maybe sometime somewhere else, about the economic conditions after modernity. So I'm going to talk about the pre-modern aesthetics, basically. And my simple argument is this, that one cannot think about pre-modern Indian aesthetics and poetics without constant reference to an ecological thinking in two ways. One, of course, is just for illustrations These thinkers go to environment, to ecology, to plants, trees, animals. And also no conceptualization of an idea is possible without taking into consideration that existence of course, because there is no binary. Yes. Thank you. So, I'll read my paper. The pre-modern aesthetics and poetics in India develops theoretical axioms out of ecological experience. And this is governed by a worldview, a darshan, first expressed and continuing from our earliest text, the Vedas, that sees no binary between the human and the natural. And therefore, forms like fables were so important to many of our writers, including Buddha and others, to articulate not only human experience lived simply, but also to articulate complexities of life. Therefore, our philosophical, literary, and cultural practices recognize and utilize environmental attributes of our lives. In this presentation, I'll talk about a few examples. Philosophy of language is Sphota, Dhvani of Bhartrahari, Dhvani of Anandavardhan, make just references to have little time, and Rasa, the aesthetic experience. Why did Indian think of this inseparable affinity between the ecological and the literary or the aesthetics? For the foundation of this thought, we need to go to some of our philosophy. I'll make references to these. The Indian thought world perceives the oneness of consciousness, nature, language, and aesthetic expressions. The objects of nature appear, as I said, both as illustrations of ideas as well as constitutive terms in the theories of language, literature, and performance. The grammarian philosopher Bhartrahari, 5th century, who was in constant debate with Dignath, the Buddhist, that's a very interesting kind of a debate, refers to natural objects to develop his theory of linguistic symbolism. Ferdinand de Saussure, who called the proponent of structuralism, you all know, was deeply influenced by Bhartrahari. He is the first philosopher to understand the arbitrary relationship between the word and meaning, and to elaborate a distinction of dhvani, sound, which is phenomenal, and the sphota, the sound of the mind, which is the word import. That's the distinction he makes. To elaborate upon this distinction, he employs an analogy of the moon's reflection in water bodies. And I quote from Subramanian's translation of Vakyapadyam Brahmakand. The reflection of an object, like the moon, appears to be connected with and to have the properties of its substratum, but it is not really so. Though it has no movement of its own, it takes on the property called the movement of the water, wave, etc., and appears to have various movements of water. Similarly, the word sphota, takes on the property of the primary sound prakrit dhvani when it is looked upon as short, long, or protracted, and those of the secondary dhvani, vakrit dhvani, when it is looked upon as having a quick, medium, or low speed. I'm reminded of the problems that many of the 20th century Western thinkers, people like Derrida and others, will say that obviously there is no other way to communicate ourselves than the language. But when language fails to communicate an idea, the point that he's trying to make over here is this: that only if you are in Plato's cave, only in the reflection of the water can you see the moon. But the moon has no movement. Similarly, the movement of the waves, the ripples in the water, is merely an appearance. The point that I'm trying to make here is this, and there are numerous examples in Bhartrahari, without actually a recognition, a lived experience with nature, it's perhaps impossible to constitute ideas which are quite pertinent to human life. Bhartrahari's thesis was developed by Anandavardhan, 9th, 10th century. Anandavardhan uses this basically difference and then takes it to poetry and literature, and the primary distinction, of course, the problem here is this, that if language is limited, if language is constrained, then how do you communicate? You communicate through suggestion. That's the theory of Anandavardhan. If language is separate from meaning, how does poetry work with this chasm between the two? How does it evoke moods, emotions, and meanings in the text and the reader? Anandavardhana argued in Dhvaniloka that it's possible through suggestion. And he quotes from various texts. I mean, Anandavardhan Dhvaniloka is full of poetry quotations from Sanskrit and Prakrit to enumerate various categories and subcategories of dhwani. Most of the words that he quotes suggest an ecological experience. For example, while discussing a particular category of dhwani, vivakshitani paravachya dhwani, a type of dhwani which is suggestion or symbolism, in which the literal sense is intended, but it is subordinate to the secondary meaning. See, compared to symbolist aesthetics in the West since mid-19th century, the remarkable thing about dhwani theory is this, that not only does a word and an object has the ability, intrinsic ability to suggest or to symbolize, even the meaning communicated by the literal word has an ability to communicate or suggest further meaning. So if you read Anandavardhan, you'll find layers of meaning. And the example that he uses, of course, is the ringing of the bell or the gong. That is waves of meaning. It's a remarkable book. Many of you might be aware of it. So he's giving that example, Vivakshit Tanya Paravachya Dhwani, where a meaning raised suggests another meaning, and he's quoting Dharmakirti. Now there's a controversy whether this is the same Dharmakirti, the Buddhist philosopher who was also the poet, but this is what the verse is. On what mountain, for how long, and what was the name of his austerity? I mean, this little parrots, that he should bite into a cherry as pink as your lip. So obviously there is suggestive meaning, the evocation of rasa. Clearly, an extraordinary perception of the natural world makes possible to explore and extend the limits of language and thought for communication of emotions and experience. In theatre, the natural and the human world cohere in the human ability to experience emotion, based as it is on the internal as well as external awakening. The basic paradigm of theatre experience again comes from philosophy. Sankhya, the earliest among the philosophical systems of India, views the physical and the mental universe as constituted of the three gunas, also the mental universe. Therefore, the Descartian dialectics is not our dialectics, because our mind is not the self that he talks about there. So this whole mental and physical universe, a prakriti, which is constituted of three gross elements. Constituted of the gross elements and three gunas that I will talk later on. So of the gross elements, earth, air, water, fire, and space, and the subtle elements: smell, touch, taste, form or color, and sound. The gross elements, the bhutas, make up the objective world, whereas the subtle elements, tanmatras, constitute the conscious self. It is the interaction of the gross and the subtle elements that constitute our objective and subjective worlds. It is therefore obvious that no reflection of the human world is possible without including the realities of the natural world. Vaisheshika philosophers employ the term padartha to denote the meaning of the word as well as the object signified by a word. Expanding its semantic universe, they call the seven fundamental constituents of the universe as padarthas. Two of them being dravyas and gunas, which is important for me right now. Dravyas, the substances of the universe, are earth, air, fire, water, and space, while the gunas, corresponding to the dravyas, are smell, touch, taste, color, touch, and sound. The gunas of the Vaisheshika and the tanmatra, the subtle elements of the Sankhayikas, and their interaction with the natural world becomes the basis, I argue, of aesthetic and literary thinking. As noted already, Sankhayikas posit gunas as the components of the physical universe, including the internal world of the humans. Therefore, there is no binary. The three gunas are sattva, principle of fineness, lightness, brightness, and pleasure; rajas, principle of activity and motion; and tamas, principle of status, indifference, and resistance. All these three actually pretty much underlie the 50 states of mind that Bharat and Abhinavgupta would constitute. The internal world, antahakara, consisting of the intelligence, ego, mind, and the sense, are also parts of the physical universe and are constituted by the gunas. The theory of the gunas consider both sentient and insentient reality as dynamic and changing all the time. In the dynamism, the gunas relate the human and the natural world in a cycle of flux and causality. Bhattanayaka, in his Hridaya Darpana, the commentary on Bharatanatyam Shastra, lost of course. Bhattanayaka in his Hriday Darpana, quoted by Abhinavgupta, categorizes the 8 rasas of Bharata in terms of the various interactions of 3 gunas. Indeed, the theory of rasa, which is the primary theme in classical Indian aesthetics and performance, cannot be explained without its ecological aspects. Bharata's Rasa Sutra, Vibhava Anubhava Vabichari Bhava, Samyogada Rasa Nishpatya, identifies the objects of nature both as Alambana Vibhava, from which the primary mental state is evoked, and Uddipana Vibhava, the contextual factors of emotion. The natural world provides particularities to a story, a play, or a poem. And we may have thousands of stories on love, but each story seems like a different story, and that depends upon the vibhavas. And an intrinsic part of the vibhavas is the natural world. The thematic and the formal achievements of a work, therefore, depend upon its newness of vibhavas, both human and environmental. While defining Shringara Rasa, Abhinavgupta says that it's the blossoming of karma and is suitable to the natural disposition of the human heart and mind. It is a tasting of the emotive state of Lavarati, latent in the heart and minds of all humanity. Shringara is also a state of effulgence and is also evoked by the beauty of the world of nature. Therefore, Bharata describes various vibhavas that evoke Shringara, such as pleasurable seasons, garlands, unguents, ornaments, of course not nature, but I'm just saying that these all are, the natural objects are equally important vibhavas of Shringara Rasa. For a comprehensive grasp of the ecological aspects of rasa theory, an etymological perspective of the concept is required, as it is a progressive development and expansion of the concept that offered Bharata 3rd century CE debatable and Abhinavgupta 10th, 11th century CE, 3rd century BCE for Bharata, provided them the possibilities for its deployment as structural and aesthetic and affective aesthetics. The point is that is rasa in the text or in the reader, or these are debates basically, these are discussions of or in the actor or the playwright. Abhinavgupta enumerates both the aesthetic configuration in the text and the effect that this configuration has on the audience during performance or the reading process. He owes this theoretical dualism of the concept of rasa to some of the oldest connotations of the term. In the Rig Veda, rasa is used in the sense of sap or essence of natural objects, the rasa of milk, water, grains, herbs, fruits, leaves, etc. Rasas from these natural objects are classified as sour, pungent, astringent, sweet, etc. With Soma rasa, the rasa sap of a special herb plant, the word takes on an added meaning. Here rasa denotes both taste as well as sap or essence and the quality inherent in it. Hence it is for the first time that here the meaning of rasa gets extended to taste and property. The Soma rasa had the properties or the qualities that produce experience of agility, strength, intoxication, and its drinking produced an extraordinary joy. Hence the meaning of Soma rasa is strength, intoxication, and extraordinary joy were included. What I'm trying to say is this, there's a progressive development by the time it reaches to Bharata and then to Abhinavgupta and in between to lots of people. Ayurveda introduces further development of this concept. It introduces a meaning in terms of the qualities or properties inherent in a natural object to produce a desirable effect. There is another sense in which rasa is used in Ayurveda. It means the essential element or elements or juices of the body. In other words, the rasa or sap of the glands of human body on which depends the growth of the body. In the Upanishadic period, the experience of the self and the essence of the natural objects are comprehended as a unitary experience. It is here that rasa is used in the sense of the tanmatra, the subtle elements of nature, that gets developed into an ontological category in later philosophies. The power of nourishment in the objects and the joy they produce upon eating or drinking as a single experience originates from this conception of rasa. The Auditorium Upanishad describes this as, from the herbs was born the grains, from the grains the strength, from the strength the body. This body is the rasa of the grains. It has been made from the rasa of the grains. It is here that the apparent dualism But the essential unity of rasa gets expressed, and this develops later as literary and aesthetic hermeneutics of Bhattanayaka and Abhinavagupta. Rasa denotes, on the one hand, the sap or essence that is extracted after crushing or squeezing an object, and the taste of some kind that inheres in it. On the other hand, it denotes the tasting of the taste, aswada, by the self. Sorry. The taste or rasa as a tanmatra inheres in the sensory organs, the mind and the ego. And since the self can reflect upon this taste, I mean the beautiful example, of course, that differentiate the tabula rasa in the 18th century Western India is this, that the mind not only reflects you, but the mind gets reflected and also conscious about the fact that it's getting reflected. So obviously the person tastes it, but then is also conscious of the fact that it's tasting it, and that's a clue to rasa experience. The Katha Upanishad says that the cognition of the rupa, rasa, gandha, shabda, sparsha takes place due to the self, due to that self. But the point is this, that the self is constituted by this single unity, by this singularity, or this sense of kind of unity of whole being. Abhinavagupta brings this perspective of the human ecological basis of existence to rasa aesthetics. In the aesthetic experience of fear, for example, the human and the natural integrate, and the emotion alone shines as both experiencing self and the experienced environment, because it then terminates into fear alone as an emotion. Because if it alone, fear alone manifests. An example, of course, is Kalidas's the description from Abhigyan Shakuntala, Moshe Abhigyan Shakuntala. And I'm quoting from Noli's translation. There he, the deer, is now gracefully, by bending of his neck, casting a glance ever and anon at the chariot which pursues him, by the contraction of the hinder half of his body, through fear of the descent of the arrow, strewing the road with grass half chewed, which drops from his mouth, kept open for exhaustion. In the experience of rasa, Abhinavagupta argues, immediately after the perception of the literal sense, a perception of different order, an inner manas perception consisting in a direct experience is experienced, and therefore appears simply and solely fear. What Abhinavagupta means, of course, is this, that the perception of the deer, for an audience, of course, that's the first perception. The second perception, which he calls perception, is the perception of the self. And when the perception of the self takes place, by which he means this, all of us have 8 or 9 states of being. Is it possible for somebody to experience that state of being? He says, yes, that's possible in aesthetics, that's possible in performance. So what happens on the stage is simply a medium. That perception makes it possible for the second perception. The second perception is the perception of fear, pure fear. That is why the question that many times students ask me when I'm teaching these things, of course, is this, that why is karun pleasurable? Aristotle is a different sort of example. Fear is, or karun is pleasurable because karun as a state of being is internal to us. How can anybody be scared of something which is internal to you? It's not possible. So what literature, what aesthetic does, that it makes possible for us to experience the being of fear in its purity. Now the point that I'm trying to make, broader point that I'm trying to make here is this, that the subtle element, the tanmatras, which constitute the gross elements of earth, air, fire, water, etc., are the ones that also constitute the self, the experiencing self. So it's only possible for the self to experience itself when it has experienced everything, including the natural world. This whole idea of binaries, whole idea that somehow, we had a great session before this one, because that's where we lived, and that's what this philosophy talks about. In that, there is absolutely no doubt that they can exist any sort of distinction between the human and the natural. The aesthetics of the self as inseparable from the world of nature is derived from the unity among all beings as stated in the Svetasvara Upanishad. And I quote, in translation of course, the same soul is a problem here, but anyway, the same soul, I should rather say the same self is in the ant, because it doesn't die, of course, that's why I can't call it soul. The same soul is in the ant, it doesn't die, basically because it will come back, that's why we have to say self. The same self is in the ant and the elephant also. The same self pervades the universe also, it is infinite. Thou art woman, thou art man, thou art hued, thou art the dark blue fly, thou art the green parrot with red eyes, thou art the thunder cloud, the seasons and the oceans. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhananjay. Now I invite, with the approval of the chair, Sri Jatendra Kumar Nayak.
I thank Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity to share some very few simple thoughts about not the profound issues that my predecessor talked about. I found the theme of this seminar, ecological aesthetics, and something intimidatingly opaque. So I decided to take refuge in the discussion of a single novel that was written in 1897, published in 1902. This was mentioned, that was 6 Acres and a Third by Fakir Mohan Senapati. It was published in 1902. And I will take just a couple of incidents from that novel and talk about the relationship between, the way the relationship between the human and the non-human worlds are constructed, interpreted, and exploited. So the tentative title of my paper is The Cow as a Paper Mill. So I'll talk about this novel, and I'll be very brief, so needn't worry. This novel can be looked at in terms of changes overtaking a social world on account of colonial policies on land, of the introduction of a new system of dispensing justice. But in the process, we tend to overlook certain other profound changes taking place in the fictional universe created by the author. We relegate these to the margins of our interpretation. And yet, when we pay attention to a few apparently trivial details and references, we become conscious of a growing awareness of a changing relationship to the non-human world, animate nature as well as inanimate nature, that shapes and defines the action. Let's briefly summarize the novel. The title draws our attention to itself. 6 Acres and a Third, written in a context which is heavily dominated by romance, intricately ornate love poems. The very title of the novel appears strikingly unusual, 6 Acres and a Third. It refers not to a human being, a beautiful heroine or a handsome hero, a prince or a princess, but to a plot of land precisely measured. It's the fate of this plot of land and its owners, and the one who dispossesses them of it, that forms the center of the unfolding action. The son of a weaver who had purchased it from a zamindar who had fallen on hard times loses it to another landlord, and the terrible consequences that follow. The novel tells the story of dispossession, and its central action involves a series of displacements at a larger level of land ownership and language. A traditional zamindar, referred to by the narrator as a bhumyadhikari, loses his estate to a Muslim horse trader after colonial rule is established in Odisha in the early part of the 19th century. The former belongs to the traditional warrior caste, Khandayats, and his relationship to his tenants is defined in terms of charity and a generous conviviality. But there is also a dark hint that these Khandayats are ignorant and relied on muscle power. The Muslim horse trader, for his part, is a reckless hedonist, gets into debt, and his jamindari quickly passes into the hands of an Odia moneylender whose boundless greed drives the action of the novel. He fraudulently grabs the plot of land belonging to the weaver couple mentioned earlier through deceit and his knowledge of the emerging colonial legal system. But things go wrong when he is arrested on the charges of having murdered the weaver's wife. His estate finally passes it into the hands of his smart city-based lawyer, Ram Lala, perhaps a non-Odia. Thus, one can read the novel in terms of a traditional order disintegrating under the weight of a new revenue administration and of a legal system that underpinned it. Land turning into a sellable commodity disrupts many lives and loosens and destroys community bonds. Odia is displaced by English, the city displaces and dominates the country. Many displacements occur. One also notices something else happening in the novel. The emergence of the acquisitive individual who defines existence in terms of his possessions. For the protagonist, who is called Ramchandra Mangaraj, who is a landlord come moneylender, everything up for sale. An obsession with maximizing of his wealth vitiates his relationship with his family. He is presented as a miser who seeks to exploit and dispossess everyone around him. He sells even the drumsticks in the trees growing in his backyard in the local market. While this reading of the novel within a social realist framework does illuminate aspects of a breakdown of a traditional agrarian social order, it leaves out or overlooks vital aspects of the novel. The way it explores ways in which the new acquisitiveness, everything turning into a sellable commodity in the market, affects and perverts man's relation to the non-human world. In the novel, the rapacious moneylender is acquitted of the charge of murder, but is sentenced to 6 months in jail, not because he has grabbed the parcel of land through deceit, but because he had acquired a white cow named Neta, which belonged to the weaver couple. The British legal system finds nothing illegal in a powerful jamindar dispossessing a weaver of his plot of land, for the formal requirements of the new laws have been made. He is guilty of a technical error. Neta doesn't figure in the list of belongings of the weaver auctioned to recover the costs of taking him to a court of law. But in the novel, Neta is not just a cow. Two perspectives on man's relation to the animate nature emerge if you carefully examine ways in which different characters relate to it and define it. To Saria, the weaver's wife, who is a childless woman, she is dear to her like her daughter. The narrator lovingly dwells on her special relationship with this animal and describes her as a member of her family. Throughout the narrative, the physical appearances of several characters, especially those who are butts of the narrator's ridicule, is described in great detail. Nearly a whole page is devoted to an affectionate description of the cow and the close bond she shares with her mistress. Then the narrator suddenly turns to a description of her udder and the amount of milk she gives every day. A disconcertingly new element now enters the narrative. The attention shifts away from the intimacy that binds a human being and an animal towards a utilitarian point of view on the cow as a resource, as a source of profit. The tone of the narrator undergoes a radical change as it prepares the reader for a new way of seeing Neta. Neta is removed, cow, from the sphere of intimacy to the realm of the market where she is but a valuable commodity, just like the parcel of land which has become a sellable commodity. The narrator offers to explain why the cow is so desirable from the point of view of the rapacious moneylender, come landlord. An illuminating comparison is introduced between the cow and a paper mill. Let me quote. A cow is like a paper mill. You feed rags, broken string, rotting weeds, and cotton in at one end of the mill, and from the other you obtain clean, white, beautiful, smooth paper. Similarly, if you feed a cow chaff, rice gruel, and grass, milk will flow from her udder. We do not know how much milk Neta produced daily, but the other day she was the topic of discussion in Mangaraj's Darbar. Everyone present agreed with one villager's estimate that Neta produced no fewer than 5 seers of milk a day. Mangaraj heaved a deep sigh and thought aloud, what? That wretched weaver owns such a wonderful cow. Look at the change in the language. He's thinking of owning that cow, whereas Saria, the weaver's wife, thought of her as her daughter. The comparison seriously undermines Saria's world and its values, the shared existence animals and humans inhabit. A living being is likened mercilessly to a machine. It can be removed from one habitat to the other, from an owner to another, because the new dispensation fails to or doesn't want to recognize the living links between human beings and animate nature. It may be mentioned here that Saria's death, which brings about the downfall of the central character in Six Seconds and a Third, is not caused only by her intense grief arising out of her loss of land. She starves herself to death in the moneylender's house, begging him to return not only her plot of land but also her cow, Neta. A subtle link between land and animate nature has been powerfully established in the economy of the narrative. But in our stubborn preoccupation with the human drama unfolding in the novel, we have missed its complex and moving negotiation between human beings and the non-human world they inhabit. Once this link snaps, the reason for living disappears, as it does in the case of Saria. Disregarding this link out of boundless greed and the dangerous tendency to see nature as a useful and productive machine causes the ruin of the protagonist of the novel. Maybe a novel written towards the end of the closing decade of the 19th century was more than a realistic narrative depicting a society in transition, a society adapting itself painfully to alien colonial order. It contains elements of prophecy we can ignore only at our own peril. Thank you.
Mr. Om Prakash Divedi.
Namaskar आप सबको, esteemed chair, my fellow paper presenters, and distinguished guests. Thanks to Sahitya Akademi for inviting me here, in particular Rao Sahab, Jyoti ji and Krishna ji. Well, the title of my paper is Eco-Precarity and the Odds Against Tomorrow. And I begin with the metaphor of ant and jaggery, taking some cue probably from the Nandari. An ant climbs up the kitchen wall and reaches out to a chunk of jaggery. It walks away with very tiny portions of jaggery. Seeing this, few more ants reach out, but this time they struggle to get the jaggery, not because it has been displaced, but because they apparently seem to be wanting for more. And in so doing, the jaggery comes down, killing all the ants in a single stroke. I start this paper with the metaphors of ant and the jaggeries, because the ant's greed for the jaggery could be seen as the human's being desire to get the most out of nature, which here stands for the jaggery. This greed of human beings has resulted into an extreme crisis for future generations on Earth. We are living in an age of precarity, a theoretical framework which I have developed on following the model of Judith Butler, Guy Standing, and Pramod Nair. A recent theoretical construct that broadly refers to precarious existences comprising crises of all kinds. Narratives reflecting precarity echo the effects of increased capitalism, urbanization, and societal development under globalization that have led to sustainable economic growth, but also caused deleterious outcomes, consequences, experiences that result in precarious realities for many populations. On 23rd August 2019, the young environmentalist Greta Thunberg issues a warning, and I quote, "Around the year 2030, 10 years, 252 days, and 10 hours away from now, we will be in a position where we will set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control. That will most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it. In this regard, and I unquote, in this regard, it becomes imperative that the existing literature be studied for how it reflects and responds to the contemporary conditions that are precarious and the effects of precarity on the lives of humans as well as the non-humans," to which Dhananjay also argued to a great extent. Both literature and environment deal with one central yet increasingly vital aspect, and that is life. Hence, what lies at the core of this subdiscipline of literary studies is the notion of ethics. What makes this branch of studies strikingly different from other isms is the fact that it attaches importance to environment, and in so doing, moves beyond the human that has been central to the history of the earth, that many of us term as Anthropocene. Even works on Marxism fail considerably to consider this crucial relationship of humans with the environment, as it was more inclined to study the binarism of rich and poor. We'll no longer live at a time when human beings remain at the center of the discourse on humanity, and this is something which we must understand. Humanism has given way to post-humanist thoughts, as it has remarkably failed to take account of mankind's responsibility to non-human beings and the environment. The utilitarian nature of globalization thrives by accumulating wealth through endless accumulation of material things, resulting in the conquest and endless exploitation of natural resources. And this, I'm just skipping out a few lines, this utilization of the material by the human beings is something which Dipesh Chakraborty in his recent books terms as the crisis of civilization. And his idea is he advances his idea on the idea of civility as such, that how it has been diluted, proliferate, and how the idea of the civility as advanced, proliferated and strengthened in the Western thought, which it is shrouded with conflicting debates. For this civility is delimiting in nature, as it views environment as an external thing, and hence an apparent refusal to narrativize it. The present paper critiques the crisis of global warming. I prefer the term global warming to climate change for the simple reason that change has a double meaning. It can also point to some betterment, which is not the case. The paper goes on to show how human vulnerability to ecological disasters and suggests that new narratives are needed to sustain and cultivate life on Earth. We live in an increasingly globalized world demarcated by an unprecedented rise of cities and technologies across the globe. This rise in the cities is what Mike Davis rightly views as the city of slums, or the planet of slums, to quote him. Whereas the metaphor of the slums could be seen to indicate multiple and acute problems that cities give birth to, thus rendering environment precarious. The lurking threats from environment have made us more vulnerable than ever in the world history. Eco-precarity, a term I borrow from Pramod Nair's excellent book, Eco-Precarity, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture, published in the year 2019, is a concept that suggests our vulnerability to and threats from the ongoing global warming. Nair theorizes eco-precarity as a phenomenon that includes ecological disasters and climate eclipse. In a way, the concept of eco-precarity could be related to Molly Bellis's idea of risk criticism, which pivots around the imminent risks from plastic, radiation, fossil fuel, waste materials, among others, to which esteemed chair also pointed out. Wallace conceptualizes eco-precarity or the risk criticism on the relationship between the speculatives and the real, the risk, the hazard, and the catastrophe. Take, for example, one of the poems titled Expert Testimony by Dr. Kirk Brown. And I will read out. We all know something will kill you. People should consider cancers could be failures. Nature, children, adults exposed, get it on the skin, ingest it, breathe it in, drink it. Through careful study, we know how much children breathe, risk, published in the air. the milligrams and cubic feet in the air, time concentration in your house, your lungs, the kidneys, the pathways, and probabilities. It's a standard methodology, and I didn't include lead or zinc. The above quoted lines reflects man's vulnerability to intoxicated environment and its horrifying power. According to Brown, we are all doomed to death one day, but it is increasingly vital to preserve the earth for future generations to come. With the change of time, new steps need to be taken. And one of the best examples could be seen in the way Singapore has technologized its environment. Ever since its decolonization, Singapore has emerged as a highly modern nation with remarkable pace of transformation. Credit goes to the excellent vision of its first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, who modeled himself as the chief gardener and God planted more than 30,000 trees on November 7, 1963, which was some kind of a new practice at that point of time. It is reported that over 5 million trees were planted between 1970 and 1992. Gardens by the Way, that is the name of one of the parks in Singapore, which if you visit, you will find a green park, which consists of transplanted flora, and visitors get a glimpse of the future ecocliffs that awaits them in the world at large. They are welcomed by a short film, which is displayed on the screen, thereby warning all the visitors of the lurking threats ahead. And I quote, in 2063, plus 2.9 degrees, a child's voice announces that half of the species are condemned to extinction. In 2080, plus 4.3 degrees, there is a 50% decline in freshwater availability. And by 2100, plus 5 degrees, the male voice concludes, the earth is just a dry rock dying in space. I end quote. This, however, as pointed out by the narrator, could be one of the possible futures for mankind. The onus is on the humans to act responsibility in a way that develops solidarity with the non-living beings. The film certainly succeeds to the extent that it offers visions of the aftermath of the ecological disasters. One has to agree that human beings have resolutely failed to be more considerate toward environment and non-living beings, thereby making us vulnerable. Eco-precarity, as Nair argues, does not point to any single environmental disaster. Rather, it takes into consideration, and I quote, blurring of a species border, the disturbances in bodily boundaries, and extends its domain to include precarious bodies, communities, families, species, and the earth itself, unquote. Taking the argument of eco-precarity ahead, one could look at Indra Sinha's Animals People, a novel which highlights the horrifying conditions of human lives as a result of the Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984. Words seem to follow and capture the flows and leakages of gases all over Bhopal, thus projecting the slow violence of the contaminated environment. This could be seen when an old Indian woman accuses the lawyer thus, and I quote, you told us you were making medicines for the fields. You were making poisons to kill insects, but you killed us instead. I would like to ask, was there ever much difference to you? Unquote. The novel exposes the hypocrisy of the utilitarian nature of globalization and thus broadens the multiple levels of vulnerability of humans to the environment. In one such scene, the character Animal points to the wonderful poisons, so good it's impossible to get rid of them. After all these years, they are still doing their work. Animal's careful observance to the changes around make him registers the things that are no longer present. Listen how quiet, no birds sing, no hops in the grass, no bee hum. Insects can't survive here. In a way, Sinha makes readers see the impending risks that await humans due to the dilation of natural things. I will just jump because I have very less time, I believe. Just 2 minutes. Huh? Yeah, fine. In one of the other quotations that I have used in this paper, it comes from Polish journalist Kapuscinski. He pictures the relentless greed of human beings in the book, The Shah of Shahs, wherein he points out the way, I quote, oil creates illusion of a completely changed life, life without work, life for free. It expresses the eternal human dream of wealth achieved through a lucky accident. In this sense, it is a fairy tale, and like all fairy tales, a bit of lie. Coming to the conclusion now, seeing from this disturbing and deeply shivering context, it is high time to construct a more inclusive project which takes into consideration the environment. After all, narratives are there is a need new modes of narratives. This is what I suggest. Because narratives are means to construct meanings out of the world that we inhabit. And this is what Alex Stephens, one of the American futurists, he argues that if we cannot imagine, we cannot build anything. So narratives are required, and a change in narratives is much needed at this present time. I finished with this.
So Rohit Mancha.
Very good afternoon to all, and I suppose it's time for all of us to breathe a sigh of relief. This is the very last talk of the whole symposium, of the whole seminar. My thanks, my grateful thanks to the Sahitya Academy for this invitation. It struck a powerful chord in me when, especially in the remarks made by the chair of the first session yesterday, Professor Harish Trivedi, the importance of the local was underscored. Professor Trivedi said, for instance, that we can scarcely do anything about the emissions in the US or China. The effort should be to try and effect change in the local framework. And that, of course, has also been an overriding theme of, for instance, tribal existence and its intimate relationship with nature. This struck, as I say, a powerful chord because I, in my talk, have focused altogether on the local, eschewing the large scale or the meso level, and have endeavored to draw a sort of a lesson or two, a conclusion or two from my observations on the local, even on the hyper-local. On revolving in my mind the theme for the session, I considered various filters through which one might view it, and settled on exploring the distance that often lies between the two P's in the title of the theme, namely precept and praxis. The provenance of that distance and what this distance implies for ecological health. As a sort of case study, I elected to home in on the academic campus where I work and live, the campus of the Indian Institute of Technology, or IIT, Bombay. I elected also not to draw upon and quote from literature, but reify the points I wish to make through personal observation and experience of the environment I live in. To start with, let me sketch the contours of that environment. In the constricting embrace of the megapolis, as it is now called, of Mumbai or Bombay, in its northern quarter, there lies an anomaly of landscape. It is visible on a scale only available to those at a considerable elevation, as to the eye of an eagle coasting on high. As if in defiance of the seething concrete sprawl that shuts it in, this anomaly is all hill and forest, glade and stream, and among its colonizers are panther, wild boar, python, racket-tailed drongo, and moths so spectacularly painted and patterned that they beggar belief. At the southern tip of this enclave lies a tiny horseshoe-shaped patch of land, which differs in some attributes from its parent body. While it too is verdant, it is to a good degree built up owing to its being an academic and residential establishment. The whole of the city-girdled swath of green is the Borivali National Park. Many of you might have heard of it or come across it. An enchanted realm that enjoys the distinction of being amongst the largest wildlife parks located in city limits anywhere in the world. The fragment of the southern tip is the campus of the IIT, an institute that nowadays bears the cachet of perhaps one of the top-ranked institutes of its kind in the country. The Borivali National Park sprawls itself over about 100 square kilometers. The park is a marvel of tropical ecology, its riches running amazingly deep. Bursting at its seams with life, it plays sanctuary to an estimated 800 species of flowering plant alone, 280 species of birds, and a scarcely credible 8,000 to 10,000 species of insects. Of the insects, actually, there has been no real census. They share it with 36 types of mammals, 50 varieties of reptiles and amphibians, and perhaps 150 species of butterfly. Some sense of the true scale of these numbers can be had from the fact that in its 150 species of butterfly alone, this dot on the map hosts some 2.5 times the number, which is a relatively modest 60, to be found in the whole of the United Kingdom. With a forest so exuberantly stocked as an immediate neighbor, linked to it by corridors of woodland, sandwiched between two sizable lakes, and until recently with much of its area given over to pockets and tracts of woodland and marsh and forested hill slope, IIT Bombay's real estate has been a very special and rich ecosystem indeed. So rich that it comes close to qualifying for the status of what naturalists call an ecological hotspot, sustaining, especially until a few years ago, a catalogue of flora and fauna so bountiful it would do a wildlife reserve proud. Many of the species here are endemic to forests and are rarely, if ever, encountered in urban settings. A ready reckoner of this biodiversity might run as follows. More than 100 species of trees, of which some 20-odd species, including the Kumbhi, Karaya, and the Kate Asan, are true forest trees, which stand cheek by jowl with a host of uncommon cultivars and exotics. Wildflowers abound. The campus boasts more than 60 of the 240 species listed in Isaac Kehemker's authoritative text on Indian wildflowers. This is evidently a hefty proportion, a striking quarter of the nation's stock of these flora concentrated in one rather microscopic arena alone. And the campus's bird life tells the same tale. Around 150 species have been recorded. It's notable here that Salim Ali's Book of Indian Birds lists some 300 commonly observed species. Thus, about half of these, again a remarkably high proportion, have been spotted on this campus. Given these many splendid riches, I could go on and on with the numbers, but I'll just move over to more qualitative things. You'd have thought that they'd be sedulously and jealously guarded, their milieu preserved without stint. This, alas, has not proved to be so. For over the years, especially over the past 15 or so, these riches have been allowed to rapidly and acceleratingly dwindle. This has chiefly had to do with the shrinking of the green cover on campus, the flora making way for new buildings, numbering in their scores. And as the green spaces have receded, so has the local ecology attenuated. Now we are at the cusp of an ecological turnaround, where a region that over decades was an ecological hotspot is apparently ineluctably getting dialed down into an ecological lukewarm spot, if not altogether a cold spot. For instance, where snake sightings were once practically a daily affair during the monsoon, one is lucky today to spot even a single snake over an entire season. It is not as if the opulence of nature here has not been documented. I myself have written a history of the Institute in which I have made it a point to both portray and enumerate this bestowal. The Worldwide Fund has also for Nature has also provided a systematic census of the campus, its plant and animal riches. The trouble is, barely anyone really takes any serious interest in this particular aspect of the campus's past or present. Why then has this devolution, so to speak, happened of the natural space? In these days of heightened environmental consciousness, how is it that preservation of a singular ecosystem such as this is being given such short shrift? The reason for this, to my thinking, is not far to seek, and the reason lies principally in two spheres, the institutional and the individual. On the institutional level, the arch players are the current catchwords that are taken to define corporate Byanatra, expansion and growth. The desire to go ever deeper, ever higher, ever broader. I'm speaking here of such measures as numbers of academic departments, numbers of students and staff, numbers of research projects, numbers of buildings of all types, labs, hostels, apartment blocks, amenities. This hunger to grow ever deeper and wider operates not just on part of the institute, but equally on the part of the central government, which bankrolls the institute. Now, growth per se is unarguably a sine qua non for the vibrancy and vigor of the work that blooms forth from an academic setup. The trouble here is that continual, unrelenting growth of this sort cannot take place without annexing, in the interests of ever more workspace and living room, land that was previously given over to woods, to water and to wildlife, nor in consequence without the ecological abridgment that results. The question then poses itself, ought it not to be a part of the mandate of an organization, especially if, or should one say even if, it is one of science and technology, to cherish and preserve the exceptional ecology that it has been so enviably favored with? and even if there isn't a mandate, ought not a center of academic learning of an enlightened sort strive to make this happen? All recent indications seem to point to a rather dispiriting response, to wit, apparently not. It's as if these days nothing can be permitted to come in the hallowed way of growth or of the more is better maxim so assiduously espoused by our governments. At some level, such an ethos constitutes, in fact, a piece of legerdemain, given that in the very same breath that our governments adjure expansion, ramification, and the like, they also issue, in rapid-fire succession, proclamations and enjoinments on the acute need for environmental awareness and protection. Possibly the supreme irony in all this is that even though an institute may boast among its departments one of environmental science, another that hosts the biosciences, a third of climate change, and so forth, these departments, while they may actively be counseling state and national level bodies on strategies and devices salutary to ecological health, seem to give curiously scant thought to the microenvironment around them, the hotspot that is being daily whittled away at their elbows. At the level of the individual, things are a little different. I myself belong in the Department of Biosciences and Bioengineering. I and my colleagues are busy ourselves probing ostensibly the mysteries of nature. All of science, of course, is purported to be an interrogation of nature, a plumbing of its enigmatic and often staggering secrets. The key feature today, however, is the degree of minuteness at which things operate. Over the last half century or so, the questions science has been asking have been going ever deeper to the core of things, becoming ever more reductionist. Biological science, for instance, has become progressively more molecular in its attentions. Scientists now work at such a fine grain that they're apt very often to lose sight of nature's overarching day-to-day aesthetics and manifestations and aren't able to look past their noses buried in the minutiae of molecules, pathways of molecules, and structures of molecules. To take an example or two, more often than I can count has this sort of thing happened. I tell a colleague with relish of the fabulous idiosyncrasies of a tree on the campus that they've never perhaps noticed before. My zest leaves them cold. They dash a quizzical glance at me, as if wondering that I might be losing some of my marbles. For they'd much rather be talking about the best stratagem to adopt in order to secure a big research grant or win one of the big awards going. I tell another colleague about the fabulous floral and faunal treasures of the campus, and within seconds they start to shuffle discomposedly and get all fidgety. On the instant, they switch to the topic to who in the department is most likely to come out tops this year in the journal impact factor or the H index stakes. If there's anyone here who's not acquainted with these terms, impact factor or H index, they are simply measures of the so to speak, quality of a journal article that has been published and the impact that it has had on the community. Today, then, it is not at all uncommon to meet biological scientists who, predicated on the research that they carry out, will avow themselves students, why even lovers of nature, but who don't harbor the faintest qualk of interest in the plant and animal life that daily surrounds them. They have in fact immersed themselves in nature, but in nature that cannot be seen even with the help of the simpler and inexpensive microscopes, much less by the naked eye, the sort of nature that can only be seen with the aid of instruments that cost tens of lakhs and often crores of rupees apiece. What price then this avowed kinship with nature, or to invoke a somewhat diegetic metaphor, has one just lost sight of the wood for the trees? Professor Gopichand Narang stated yesterday that the environment needs to be a lived experience. In the present age, we seem to be ever increasingly divorced from this lived experience. Disjunction and disconnect seem to be the order of the day. Likewise, we saw how tribal peoples lead their lives entirely at one with nature, living with nature and not of it, in equality with nature, not as its conqueror. The upshot of what I have described above at my IIT is that those very people who are unraveling nature at its profoundest levels have become insensible to its charms at their most accessible and expansive. And yet, were you to quiz the same people on subjects of ecological or environmental concern on the larger canvas, such as the city of Bombay or of the nation, they turn out to have sympathies aligned well on the side of conservation and perpetuation. So the requisite precepts, I'm coming back to the two P's in the title of the theme, precept and practice. The requisite precepts are well in place, but a certain sensibility towards nature that would translate into praxis is wanting. And what this in turn boils down to is that when it comes to taking cognizance of the erosions being wrought on the ecology, even in one's immediate environs, there are precious few souls who care and scarcely any voices that are raised. Taking together the observations that I have recounted, then, it seems to me that what keeps the two P's, precepts and praxis, from fusing together into an efficacious whole is what one might term a sensibility deficit. People in our epoch seem to have lost or willfully repudiated the sort of worldview that unites one with nature and inspires in one the custodianship of a many-faceted crystallization in miniature, in other words, the local ecology. And several speakers in prior sessions have remarked on the violence visited upon nature owing to human avarice, the founts of which appear to be illimitable. The degradation wrought by mining, urban expansion, timber felling, and so forth were all touched upon. What I am speaking of here is a gentler and subtler form of indifference, much gentler and subtler than those forms of activity, but no less insidious or dangerous for that. I am speaking of plain, simple human aspiration and ambition of the material, worldly sort, which at bottom is but a manifestation of that more primal attribute, human cupidity, the amassing of material riches at any cost. So long as this sensibility deficit that I have spoken of prevails, I for one find it hard to see how we as a community or as a species can awaken to the injuries that we unceasingly visit upon that very ecology which vouchsafes us life, beauty and sustenance. Perhaps only a catastrophe of no small proportions will serve to bridge the yawning chasm between precept and praxis, and here I echo what my predecessor just said, much as Greta Thunberg and her ilk keep prophesying in the realm of climate change. Thank you very much.
10 minutes questions. No, I'll conclude or we'll take 10 minutes questions.
We can invite questions.
We'll take a few questions, 10 minutes please.
You can conclude.
Okay. Obviously, I mean, it's very diverse points of view we had. As I said in the beginning, eco-criticism is an umbrella of various streams of thoughts and approaches. And it's actually eco-criticism started as a rebellion against profusion of literary theory in the structuralist and post-structuralist period. But now what's happening in eco-criticism is there are a lot of theory coming up in eco-criticism also. That's a tragedy because then, there is paralysis by analysis. That's what happens always. And you look at the discourse in the world, now like everybody talked about climate change or global warming as he said he prefers to call it. Since 80, we have been working, the UN has been working to solve the climate issue, but it has only worsened in the last 40 years. So that is how the world works, unfortunately. Our discourse and the actions are completely different. The binary is there. And I do have problems with a lot of terms used, like Anthropocene, the term was used by some speakers. Anthropocene, the term when it was coined, it put the entire responsibility of human beings. And who is this human being, then some speakers also referred human greed. It's not human greed. All of us are not greedy people. So it's a certain section of people who are greedy. So you have to create that binary also. You have to make it political also. So that's the whole question. So if you put everything responsibility on the humans, where is this human? You say humans greed, humans exploitation. So there is a certain class which is doing that. So that aspect has to come in. And I think Mr. Vedi spoke about the binary in Marxism. Just for clarification, I accept that all the points of view have to prevail. But since 1980, there has been a huge rereading of Marxism in the environmental sense. And the whole lot of, you can fill a library with books on the natural vision of Marx. The Stalinist vision is now thrown away. That Marxism doesn't exist anymore. And Marx is seen as an environmental philosopher now. I told you, you can fill a library with the books written on that. John Bellamy Foster to start with. You can read John Bellamy Foster. There's so many. Andreas Mann's book called Fossil Capital. So that binary thing doesn't exist as far as today's leftist thought is concerned. Obviously, as I said, all the perceptions come in. Even the question of precarity, for example. Precarity, what is precarity about? Who has created this precarity? You'd ask that question. Instead of saying we are precarious, you'd ask the question, who created this precarity? The latest precarity is that the digitalization is coming in a big way. In fact, I have written on this question of digitalization. It's not leftists who are writing about this. Consultancies like McKinsey has come out with studies saying that in the next 10 years, 80 crore people are going to lose jobs because of digitalization. Why do we want technologies like this when the whole objective of economic growth is that you provide jobs to people? It's a question of survival. So precarity is being created because capital accumulation has come to a stage where further accumulation is difficult. So digitalization has been invented for more capital accumulation. You throw the worker out. There's a factory in China, Foxconn, from where all the Porsche smartphone, but whoever uses a smartphone, all your parts come from that factory, Foxconn. That's why coronavirus, smartphone sales have collapsed in India because of coronavirus. And Foxconn doesn't have many workers. It's a fully automated factory which works 24 hours. No light also is required. It's all robotized. So the world is moving towards that. So who is creating this precarity for what? That question, if you don't ask, if you don't make the environmental question political, then you are trying to make it hazy so that everybody can value. And as I said, then paralysis by analysis. That's right. So, but I am somebody who wishes to accommodate, like from the ancient days, our epics have. I have myself spoken and presented papers on the ecological vision in our epics. So all that is fine. But we have come to a question where our whole survival is at stake. Then you have to take a stand. You cannot wallow in the haze of theory. You take a stand and you have to be political. And I think eco-criticism in future, it has started growing in that direction. It has not grown so much, but now I can see signs of it growing. I've seen a few books in the last few years in eco-criticism where this perspective is developing. That Thoreauvian perspective, it has reached it. It has reached a plateau, so it has to plateau out. Now you are facing a question of survival. You definitely have to ask questions. Growth for whom? Growth for what? Digitalization for whom? For what? So all this talk we do about indigenous tribes, all that, the question ends there. In Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, who is displacing them? Who is destroying the forest? That question we need to ask. All this romantic theorizing is not going to help unless we get into the crux of the problem. We have to start asking growth for whom? And modernity doesn't require growth. Industrial capitalism is not required for modernity. That's this whole concept which Samir Amin has articulated. He died, I think, last year, in 2018. Samir Amin has said, you can delink modernity from capitalist growth. Modernity is about cultural modernity. Modernity is about living in tune with nature. You can live in tune with nature. You can lead a modern life. You don't need us this to fill the pockets of a few people. 1% people. It's a 1% economy today, even in India. It's a 1% economy. So long as you obfuscate this reality, I think we're not facing the truth. I think I conclude there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Question 2.
Did we expect questions after your...
No, that is not strategy.
It's
But
okay. I'll ask
he's
you privately.
off the stage, you can talk.
Yeah, I'll ask you privately.
I congratulate one person.
संगोष्ठी यहाँ समाप्त हो रही है, कुछ अच्छा नहीं लग रहा है. I thank all the 42 scholars who presented their papers as well as chaired the sessions, and hearty thanks to you all who have been with us all through 3 days. The 3-day seminar ends here. Thank you all. Thanks for being with Sahitya Akademi.